Hello there. Today I'm going to talk about how we went through the coronavirus crisis while we were in Jingmai. So it was the Chinese New Year and we went back to Jingmai to spend that holiday with our family in our tea factory. And everything was going well when we were on the road to Jingmai. We were starting to hear about the virus crisis. Well, we knew there was a virus running around in Wuhan, but at the time it wasn't a really important news. It's like the news you get in the headlines every once in a while. So when we arrived in Jingmai, all the roads were open. There was nothing special, life as usual. People were getting ready for the new year, so everybody was home and we had a good time until the very day of the new year, actually, when the government decided to close all the roads and to actually kind of quarantine, isolate every city. So at that moment we couldn't go back to the city. Actually, we couldn't even go out of the village. We still had access to the tea gardens, to Taipingzhang, all the area above the village, but the main road back to the city was closed. And it was a very sudden move and totally unexpected. Actually, it went from a small piece of news in the headlines to a crisis that would affect us directly in just a day. So what was our first feel about it? I think mine was maybe some kind of anger, saying that the government is just doing this to oppress people, just because they have the power to restrain our freedom. They will do it just to assert, kind of enslave us, assert their power over us. So that was my first train of thought, and I was a bit angry. Some other people were totally accepting. Some didn't care really. They said it was just nothing, but since the government forces you to stay at home, you'll do it anyway. Some people saw maybe the end of the world or some really big crisis coming. So we were staying in Jingmai, and as the days went by, we could see more and more cases, the virus spreading all across China in an exponential manner. And I think we should always be somewhat worried about exponential growth. I remember that kind of deal, there was a guy who won a chess game against another one, and he said, okay, you can pay me a simple thing, you can pay me in wheat, just put a grain of wheat on the first case, then another grain, then 2 grains of wheat on the second, 4 grains on the third, 8 grains on the fourth, and that goes until you fill the chessboard. And he said, okay, it doesn't seem like a lot of wheat, but actually I calculated, and it's more wheat than all of humanity has ever produced, and it will maybe take centuries to produce that much wheat. And that's how powerful the exponential function is. So when you have a virus spread, at the beginning you think, oh yeah, there's only 50 people contaminated, so it's no big deal, I have a very low chance of having the virus. But the thing is, 50 people, let's say if the number of people contaminated doubles every day, well, after 10 days you have 50,000 people, you have 1,000 times more, okay? If it doubles every day, it will be multiplied by 1,000 every 10 days. So it's actually not really the number of cases you have now which is worrying, but more the growth, actually, the growth with that exponential characteristic. So we could think that the government understood this, but the people did not, because when you think for just a few cases closing all of China, it's ridiculous. But if you start thinking more rationally about it, it's not. Yet in these kind of events, there's not much room for rational thought, because yes, we all have the statistics, most of us know how an exponential function works, and yet we just have opinions about the crisis. opinions which are more related to your optimism or pessimism. And at one time, when I could see that that exponential growth was quite steady, was picking up really, I was thinking, yeah, that's it. This is the end of the world as we know it, because everybody is going to get contaminated, or maybe we're going to have to live in seclusion for the rest of our lives, in fear of that virus spread. And at that time, you can feel the void inside you, you know, just a bit like the feel that you have when you stumble in the stairs. You have it for just 1 second, but with that kind of crisis, you try to think about the future and you just feel the void. You feel as if there was a black hole inside you, like you're kind of swallowed by your entrails. You're kind of falling infinitely in the void. And that's anxiety, right? I think it's something that most people experience, but maybe we experience it at different degrees. So this we cannot really know, because it's hard, we cannot really share what we're feeling deeply inside. But what's for sure is that people react, people deal with anxiety in different manners. So some people were maybe stuck in some kind of, optimism, you could say, somewhat delusional optimism, like this crisis is going to end, you know, like the virus will just stop by itself, maybe with the good weather, maybe, at some point the virus will just decide to stop spreading, so things will go well. Well, we don't really know why, but things will come out well. So that's a way of dealing with anxiety. You could say this is hope. Then some people dealt with anxiety with resignation. Everybody is gonna die. What about it? Everybody in the end must die, right? So maybe we can die tomorrow, maybe we can die in 50 years. It doesn't really matter after all, because, you know, life is absurd. It's just chaotic, and we're just like rocks on the sea, you know, being just thrown around with the tide, and there's nothing we can do about it. So maybe this is some kind of resignation, fatality, and you could say a sort of nihilism, you could say, that whatever happens, you don't really care because nothing matters. And I must say, at some point I was in this mindset actually, that this was not so important. Well, if you're optimistic and that you live through bad times, it's hard for you to imagine that things can get even worse. You always hope for things to get better. Well, what happens when they get worse? You get even more anxiety, because you feel that's something you don't want, and that you're trying to grip the handles of hope, and they are always sliding off your hands. Now, if you're pessimistic, maybe you're already in that mindset that things are going to go awfully bad, and maybe in some way that helps us accept reality better. I feel that I would think I'm a pessimist, and I would think that it helps me control my anxiety, because I'm always prepared for the worst. And I'm not hoping for the worst, but I'm prepared for it. So I often find myself very happy when I see that the real outcome is not what I predicted. It's a better outcome. But often what I see with my optimistic friends is that they are disappointed, and it creates anxiety. So there is that thought about the crisis, about the virus, but that virus, we don't see it really. There was nobody sick around us. Well, there were a few sick people in the city 40 kilometers away from Jingmai, and that's why actually the area was sealed off. While a lot of effort was put into containing the virus in Wuhan, and also a lot of the medical effort was focused on Wuhan. Well, for example, a lot of the army medical corps went straight to Wuhan actually to help, and you see that they built those big hospitals very quickly. Of course, that's an effort that can only be focused on a somewhat small area compared to the rest of China. And you can think that in rural Yunnan, like around Jingmai, which is you could say a less developed area, the infrastructures there wouldn't be able to cope with a massive epidemic. So I think that's the rationale of the government at the time, is to take the strongest measure, even if the people really didn't understand them, so as to contain the virus and make sure that the medical facilities weren't overwhelmed. Retrospectively, we could see that it worked well, but at the time we had no idea about how fast the virus would spread, and we didn't even know who really got the virus, because at the time you could have a lot of people with just a common cold. And I was having a common cold at the time, so I was coughing a lot, but fortunately I had no fever, so that was a good indicator that I was unlikely to have the virus. But the problem is the hospitals were overwhelmed for people who wanted to be tested, and of course most of these tests came back negative, because at the time very few people had the virus in comparison to people who had a common cold. But seeing people coughing or having fever is enough to scare other people. So when you're confronted to such a crisis, maybe you'd want to think rationally about it. But the problem is you can't really. I remember a saying of Spinoza, the philosopher, who said that whatever logical argument you use, you're only an advocate for a viewpoint, and it's actually very hard to change someone's viewpoint even with rational facts, because you can always find rational facts that support your view, and you can easily cherry pick, and eliminate rational thoughts that go against your vision. So in the end, I figured that most people just have opinions and feelings, and the rational part, it was down to just following the government advice, like don't go out, wash your hands, avoid contact with other people, things like that. And I think that's just so much that a government can do. Now in China, the particularity of China is the government is authoritarian, so people are very acceptive of the government power, and if the government says you cannot go out, it's not really a suggestion, it's you're forced to stay at home. So the thing is that in Jingmai, whatever your opinion, you were just forced to stay in the village. You couldn't say I'm going to see my friends in the other village, because there are checkpoints along the way, and so people just won't let you pass through. And I found out that in democracies where the government cannot really force people to do that, at least not under normal circumstances, you'll have different opinions, and a controlling factor then will more likely be social pressure. Like what I saw on social media from France is like, you shouldn't go out because you risk contaminating others, so it's a matter of being civilized and helping other people. And so people who don't follow this advice will be shunned upon by their peers on social media or in real life. While in China it wasn't really the case, there was no criticism that we addressed to each other as peers in Jingmai. There was just that central and faraway government which was just putting pressure on the whole village. And I think the idea of having an external force like the central government forcing you to do stuff, it actually creates a climate of solidarity rather than conflict between your peers, between people in Jingmai, because we were all stuck in Jingmai, we were all in the same boat, and there was no real point in criticizing each other on our behavior. The government officials were there to do that, like some kind of nurses or some kind of temporary police hired to man the checkpoints. And actually I found that authoritarianism somewhat reassuring, and it helped manage anxiety because it wasn't our peers, it wasn't a direct pressure that forced us to restrain our freedom. It was a factor from the outside. So at that point, the restriction of freedom by the government is the same as gravity that restricts your freedom. Now you were never angry at gravity for keeping your feet on the ground. You were never really enraged at not being able just to fly away, to escape, just because gravity was preventing you to do it. And after a few days of control like this, I think most of us came down to accepting the fact that Jingmai was just a hard boundary, like we were bound to stay in Jingmai for a known period of time. And I think once we accepted that, there was much less anxiety actually. This is just how life was going to be. So we were more thinking about like, yeah, we're going to do some gardening, we're going to start growing vegetables. How can we cope with a long-term life in Jingmai? And at that time we didn't know it was going to be for only a month, maybe it was going to be for a year, for 10 years, who knows, because the virus was always spreading and we didn't know much about the virus, we just knew that it was reaching closer and closer to us. So once you've accepted that your freedom will be limited for a time and that you might not even have it again actually, now you get to really value what freedom was before when you had it. Maybe being able to visit your friends, maybe being able to travel in some other areas. Actually, we had planned to take the kids to a trip in Dali in the northwest of Yunnan, so that had to be cancelled. So that's one thing actually that you can see. You can see that retrospectively your life was very good. And of course you can focus on how shitty your life is right now that you don't have freedom, but you can also think about the past, have a bit of nostalgia and enjoy in your mind how good life was before. And the power of thinking, you still have it. So what did we do when we were in Jingmai? Well, the thing is, you could spend your whole day reading the news on how the virus spreads, but will it really help actually in not getting the virus? I think no, because from the time that the government is in control, they will make the decisions for you, and they are probably better informed actually than we were while in Jingmai. But some of my friends were reading the news every day, and every day was just talking about the virus, how it spread, what were the symptoms and everything. I think it's good to have basic information, necessary information, but too much thinking about the virus actually sustains the anxiety. And the more important thing you're losing is time. You could see actually that lack of freedom as a blessing, because for once in your life you have an undetermined period of time in which you're at home, you have no responsibilities but to stay at home, and you can do really what you want in your mind. Maybe it's an opportunity to study something new, to read books, to spend time with your family, to have real meaningful conversations with your relatives. Maybe it's time to learn how to cook properly, or learn about philosophy, or to learn about playing music, things like that. And if from the start you decide that this restriction of freedom is just a hard limit, it's just like gravity, it just exists in this universe, there's no way around it, you can stop wasting your time trying to find escapes in the physical world, and you can go directly into digging inside you in the immaterial world, in your mind. You could actually see that this restriction of freedom is actually a freedom, because you don't have to go to work, and that's the only time you have, a limited time somewhat, to study what you want, to define a goal and struggle hard for it. So for me it was, my goal was reading more philosophy, So I went to read a lot of books every day, and I think I did some interesting work on myself during this time. Work which was not really related to the virus. The virus was just an afterthought. And actually, when I was thinking about the crisis, I was more thinking about how much time do I have left to finish my studies until the time when we'll be released, and then we'll have freedom, but then because of that freedom, I won't have time to finish my studies. So in some way, I almost had the hope that the crisis would sustain itself for a while so that I could have more time to dig into what I was interested in. So you see that in some way that concept of freedom was reversed, because for me at that time in my mind, the free time was when I actually had time to do what I was focused on, and not really whether I had time to visit friends or go on a trip or do my daily activities, my daily business. Let's imagine that with the crisis, you have died and you're now a new person in a new world where the restriction of going out is as strong as the restriction of gravity. And now you have to live in this world. There's no real explanation for gravity, just like there's no real explanation for why you cannot go out. This is just how it is. And now try to make the best out of it. Try to get into some introspection. Try to think deeply about meaning. Try also to think about how bad the crisis is. Now you're restricted of your freedom, but you still have food on the table, you have running water at home, you have electricity, you have the internet. You can actually do a lot of things from home that maybe other situations would not allow you to do. So you know I'm an avid tea drinker, and to make the matters worse, we only have very few teas in Jingmai. I think we only had 5 cakes available. Only 5 cakes, while at home in Pur I'm used to having hundreds of different teas. And so I started drinking those 5 cakes, and I found it very repetitive. So I thought, why not make the matter even worse? Why not have just one tea to choose from? So that's a quick choice to make. So I limited myself to drinking every day the same tea, the Spring 2017 Jingmai Gulan that we made in our factory. And so for the last 2 weeks of the crisis, I was drinking only this tea. So I ended up drinking almost the whole cake every day, maybe 3 times a day. And it taught me a lot actually, because I hadn't done that in a long time, because I'd never had the opportunity to have such restrictions put on me. And it taught me about tea because it taught me to appreciate the taste of tea for what it is. Like, you have only one choice, and you're not talking about the diversity, you're not comparing different tea, but you're trying to really get the deepest understanding possible of one single tea. And then when you go back to drinking different teas, you really feel the difference. You feel that they taste, you just better understand the variety of Pur tea, the complexity. So this is how I dealt with the crisis. First there was some anger, then some anxiety, and then I chose to focus on one topic, which was fundamental philosophy. So this was a fairly tricky subject that I hadn't studied much before, and by doing this it allowed me to just forget about the virus. I was just checking the news once in a day, and following the government recommendations and restrictions, and I didn't see anybody. I was just studying. I was taking care of my baby, of course, and drinking tea and staying with our family. And the fact that I deeply engaged in those philosophical studies made the time pass very quickly. And actually I was just almost mildly disappointed at the end of the crisis, because now that we had freedom again, I wouldn't have as much time to study philosophy as I had during the quarantine. So I just learned to enjoy that lack of freedom. So here the real challenge is acceptance. Acceptance of the unknown, of the ambiguity, acceptance of suffering. Because let me be clear, some people might find a lack of empathy in what I'm saying. I think there is empathy. It's just that I'm not just sending prayers and being optimistic, just wishing for things to go well. I'm just acknowledging, looking at the suffering, acknowledging it, and accepting it. So I think it's just good to take a good look at the suffering, see that it exists, understand that it's part of the universe we're in, and just make the best out of it. So my recommendation to go through that crisis is focus. Focus on a topic that maybe you already love. You could focus on tea drinking and really go through your collection and try to deeply appreciate the taste of each tea, or do like I did, just pick one tea and get deep into that tea to really understand what's the tasting experience like and things like that. Or you could choose a topic that you feel you've neglected, but that you feel would make you a better person, and just focus on it, study. You have this opportunity, this great, maybe once in a lifetime opportunity to do some deep work on a subject you choose. Time is the most valuable commodity we have, and now you're given 1 month of free time, so make the best out of it. Don't spend your time reading about all kinds of news and statistics and probabilities that will make your anxiety worse and that won't help you grow as a person. At the end of the crisis, when you'll be much more knowledgeable, you'll really feel you'll have accomplished something. What will you tell your grandchildren about the crisis? Will you just tell them, oh, it was miserable, I spent a whole month at home suffering and thinking about how bad the universe is, things like that, how unfair the world is? Or would you tell them, it was a great challenge that made me a better person? It's up to you. That's the key thing to understand. In the world, there are matters on which we have no control. We just have to accept them and focus on what we have control over. I think we should always see the bottle half full, but you shouldn't expect someone to refill the bottle. You should actually expect the water to evaporate slowly, so that the next time you see that bottle, it's maybe a third full, a quarter full. Maybe it's getting empty, but there is still water in it, and you can always see what water is remaining. Now, of course, if someone refills the bottle, you can rejoice, you can be super happy, because you weren't expecting it. Actually, if you were expecting it, you won't be particularly happy. That will only be a temporary relief until the water evaporates again. So I think overall, this of the coronavirus in Jingmai was a positive experience for me. It helped me grow wiser. I learned things along the way, and the physical constraints existed but weren't that bad, right? I'm still alive. Now what if I had caught the virus? Then of course I would be out of luck, but I would still see the bottle half full. You could think that if you catch the virus, you still have a fairly low probability of dying, and if you end up dying, then you won't be here to notice it. And at least when dying, you will know that you'll have done your best to be the best person possible and to realize yourself. So in the end, you will have had a meaningful death. To finish, I will still address my best wishes and prayers for you. I hope things will get better, even though I don't expect them to be better. Even in the worst situation, I hope you will still be able to see the light at the end of the tunnel, the stars brightening the dark space. So I address my best wishes, and I hope you will have a lot of meaningful findings about yourself and maybe about tea during this hard time. Thank you.